July 12, 1944. 0417 hours. Northern perimeter of Carpiquet Airfield. The sky held a thin gray pressure that signaled dawn but refused to commit to it. The air smelled of damp soil, cordite residue, and crushed hedgerow leaves. Allied infantry companies across the sector braced for movement they could not see. German Panther tanks had been probing the line for 3 consecutive nights, testing weak points with slow, deliberate approaches that used hedgerow shadows as armor. They advanced only a few meters at a time, stopped, listened, then shifted again. That method shattered the nerves of inexperienced soldiers and strained the endurance of seasoned ones. Anti-tank doctrine assumed visibility, depth, spacing, and clear firing angles. None of that existed here. Darkness turned every hedgerow into a wall and every wall into a guessing contest with 45 tons of steel. Corporal Elias Vance crouched near a shallow fold in the ground that looked insignificant in daylight but mattered in darkness. He pressed his hand into the dirt and ran his eyes along the outer hedge line, comparing terrain to the pencil sketches in his pocket. Vance was 28, narrow-faced, quiet, and better at measuring distance than describing it. Before the war he surveyed new construction zones for a municipal planning department. He worked alone most days, walking empty fields with a tripod, chains, a transit, and a notebook. His job demanded precision. If a line was off by even a few inches, foundations poured at the wrong angle. Errors compounded. Months of work failed. That discipline shaped him more than he realized. When he joined the service, other recruits joked that he spoke in numbers more than words. They called him the map reader. They respected him without understanding him. The infantry around Carpiquet faced a specific problem. German armor had shifted from daylight assaults to limited night probes. These probes were not intended to break the line. They aimed to stress Allied infantry, locate mortar sites, identify machine gun nests, and trigger premature anti-tank fire. Allied bazooka teams often fired too early or too late. The terrain blocked sight lines. The hedgerow network twisted angles, concealed depressions, and produced false silhouettes. Tank crews used this to their advantage. They halted behind thick bushes, waited for nervous movement, then advanced again. That pattern created panic for forward rifle platoons forced to listen to an unseen threat while lacking tools to counter it. Vance studied this problem with the same mindset he once applied to undeveloped farmland. He noticed that the Panthers always followed 2 predictable corridors carved through the bocage by earlier traffic. One corridor angled along a drainage ditch. The other followed a narrow farm path cut between tangled vegetation. Both created natural approaches for armor. They were invisible in darkness unless you understood the slope, grade, and soil compression. Vance understood these cues instinctively. His mind formed straight lines where others saw chaotic undergrowth. During the first 2 nights of probes, anti-tank teams tried to form kill zones using standard doctrine. They placed Panzerschreck teams 10 to 15 meters behind hedges, sighted along expected approaches, and waited for silhouettes. The method failed under low light. Teams misjudged angles. They fired at front armor that deflected the blast. Some teams relocated during lulls and stepped into open gaps exposed to coaxial machine gun fire. Command suffered casualties from bad positioning rather than bad weapons. On the 3rd night, Vance knelt beside a hedgerow section and watched a Panzerschreck crew miss a perfect angle by less than a meter. He saw the backblast illuminate their position, followed by a burst of MG-34 fire that cut bark from the hedge and forced them to crawl away wounded. Afterward, the platoon lieutenant walked the line muttering that someone needed to find a way to position crews without relying on sight. Vance listened without speaking. In surveying work, he had guided laborers to precise locations at dawn or dusk using lines snapped with chalk cords. A single strike produced a straight reference across uneven ground, giving workers a simple path to follow. Map coordinates mattered, but human placement needed physical guidance. He stared at the hedgerow shadows and thought about that snap of chalk. The idea formed slowly. Ropes could replace chalk cords. Glow tape segments could replace daylight powder. Pre-measured lengths could create straight markers invisible to distant observers but readable at arm's length. If laid quietly before night probes, those ropes could guide anti-tank teams to exact, pre-calculated firing angles. They needed only a few seconds of low visibility to orient themselves. The method would not expose positions if handled correctly. Glow tape faced the ground. Soldiers read the pattern by touch and brief downward glances. The Germans would not see anything unless they crossed the rope itself. Vance searched through his kit and retrieved spare cord, tent lines, ration box ties, and strips of cloth. Over several hours he stitched and knotted these into 3 primary guide ropes. Each rope had segments of faint glow tape spaced with the same measurement system he used on surveying chains. Every 5 feet a single strip. Every 10 feet a double strip. Every 20 feet a triple strip indicating relocation or firing position. He produced a crude but functional grid system capable of guiding movement in darkness with no noise and minimal visibility. By early morning he brought the idea to his platoon sergeant, who stared at the ropes with a skeptical frown. The sergeant said it looked like a clothesline and smelled like wasted time. Vance stayed calm. He explained the logic with careful clarity. Armor moved in predictable lanes. Crews needed flanking angles. Precision mattered more than speed. These ropes ensured exact placement even when soldiers could not see more than 2 meters ahead. After a moment, the sergeant allowed a quiet trial before the next expected probe. He agreed not because he believed in the idea, but because casualties had eroded confidence in standard practice. Desperation opened the door. Vance spent the remaining hours mapping angles with a transit he had improvised from a compass, a metal bracket, and a carved wooden base. He paced distances, counted steps, and memorized the sound of wind moving through specific hedges. By 20-30 hours he had marked 2 firing positions with buried stakes and tied ropes that he would later drop into place when the probe began. Night returned heavy and silent. Soldiers whispered. Panthers growled somewhere beyond the dark. Vance waited with a patience shaped by years in empty fields, measuring distance by sound. The first vibrations reached the forward line shortly after 0140 hours. They came through the soil before they carried through the air, a low mechanical thrum that pulsed beneath the hedgerow roots. Veterans recognized it instantly. Panthers moving in low gear. Slow, deliberate, confident. The pattern always signaled a probe, not a breakthrough attempt. The tanks advanced carefully, using darkness to feel their way toward Allied positions. Riflemen raised their heads an inch from the mud, listening for direction. Vance did not look toward the sound. He studied the ground at his feet and reached for the coil of rope weighted with a smooth stone at one end. His system depended on silence. One mistake ruined everything. The platoon sergeant crouched beside him, skeptical but willing to observe. Both men kept their helmets tilted forward to avoid stray glints of moonlight. Vance steadied his breath, then flicked his wrist. The weighted end of the rope arced forward, landing inside the hedgerow gap he had measured 12 hours earlier. The sound was softer than a bird hopping across a branch. Vance tugged once to confirm placement. The rope lay exactly where he intended. He dropped a second rope to shape the angle that would guide the Panzerschreck team toward the left flank approach. The team leader, waiting 10 meters behind them, watched the process with wide eyes and a mixture of confusion and hope. The glow tape strips, invisible to anyone more than a few steps away, faced the dirt. Each strip produced a faint green smear only when viewed from above. Soldiers needed to bend close to read them. This minimized exposure. The German tanks, still 80 to 90 meters out, had no chance of detecting anything. Vance finished laying the third rope, the one marking the retreat path to an alternate firing position. He stood slowly, brushed soil from his palms, and nodded to the waiting team. The Panzerschreck crew moved without hesitation. They followed the rope markers as if tracing lines on a map. 5 feet, 1 strip. 10 feet, 2 strips. 20 feet, 3 strips signaling the final firing node. The crew settled into the position Vance had calculated using slope angle, expected tank path, and hedge thickness. The assistant loader checked the backblast area, then pressed himself into the vegetation. They waited. Tension settled across the field like a pressure system. The lead Panther crawled into the southern corridor with the deliberate caution of a crew that understood everything about bocage fighting. They kept their bow pointed slightly right to avoid telegraphing movement through breaks in the hedge. The tank's commander scanned with a periscope, rotating slowly to catch any reflection. The machine advanced in half-meter increments. The absence of machine gun bursts made the air feel heavier, each second stretching into the next in measured strain. The second Panther shadowed the first at a distance of 30 meters. This spacing allowed room for maneuver but preserved mutual support. Germans had learned that close spacing made armor vulnerable to clustered ambushes. Wide spacing exposed isolated vehicles to infantry infiltration. The chosen distance represented doctrine shaped by Eastern Front experience. Vance had anticipated this. His rope markers formed 2 converging arcs that would position the crew to fire at both tanks if the timing allowed. Infantry along the line held their breath. No one fired. No one moved. Standard doctrine warned against early engagement. The Panthers were not here to attack in force. They were testing nerves. If riflemen panicked and shot at shadows, The German crews would identify firing locations, call artillery and attack that position at dawn. Vance crouched behind the hedge and watched the faint, moving distortion created by the lead Panther's warm exhaust shimmer against cool night air. He timed its approach by counting the intervals between gear shifts. He pictured the diagrams he had drawn, the angles he had calculated, and the exact moment when the tank's flank would align with the Panzerschreck team. The Panther reached that point. The loader tapped the gunner's shoulder once. The gunner exhaled. The Panzerschreck tube rose a few centimeters. The gunner braced. The first shot fired with a sharp burst of compressed flame. The round streaked across 20 meters and struck the Panther's side at the join between the hull plate and the lower turret ring. The explosion echoed through the corridor. A brief eruption of sparks followed, then a heavy metallic groan as the tank jerked to a halt. Flames licked from vents along the engine deck. The crew inside scrambled. Some tried to climb out. Riflemen held fire. The tank burned in silence, its machine gun locked in a dead angle, unable to bring suppressing fire on the ambush site because of the hedge thickness. The second Panther halted instantly. German tank crews were trained to stop when they suspected an ambush. Movement might reveal position. Stillness created uncertainty. The commander of the second vehicle rotated the turret toward the left hedge line, not knowing the shot came from an angled forward position. The crew listened for more movement. Smoke drifted through the hedgerow gaps in pale streaks. For a moment nothing happened. Vance motioned for the Panzerschreck team to shift positions. They moved along the second rope path, guided again by the glow tape strips. The shift took less than 5 seconds. They reached the alternate firing point, a shallow depression behind the hedge that provided an oblique angle on the second Panther's flank. The gunner reloaded. The loader steadied the backblast zone. The sergeant watched with disbelief as the system worked exactly as Vance had described. The second shot fired. This one punched into the Panther's side above the suspension. The explosion ruptured the internal stowage racks. The tank rocked, then emitted a deep, choking rumble before its engine stalled. The commander attempted to reverse but had already lost hydraulic pressure. Flames burst from the rear hatch. The crew abandoned the vehicle, stumbling toward the ditch. Riflemen captured 2 and forced the others into cover under threat of fire. The field fell quiet except for the crackle of burning fuel. Infantry murmured in amazement. The platoon sergeant looked at Vance with a new expression. Respect mixed with disbelief. The system had worked not once but twice in under a minute. The ropes remained undetected. The firing positions had been perfect. No Allied casualties occurred. The line held without revealing its full strength. Word spread along the trench network. Soldiers repeated the phrase chalk line rope drop, unsure who coined it. Some joked about map tricks. Others whispered that this was the first time in days they felt in control against the terror of unseen armor. Vance accepted none of the attention. He retrieved his ropes, coiled them neatly and pressed them into a pouch. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the intensity of the moment. He knew the tactic would need refinement. He also knew it had changed everything. Dawn pressed slowly against the horizon, revealing forms with reluctant clarity. Smoke from the 2 Panthers lingered in twisting columns that drifted across the hedgerow tops and settled into the shallow depressions of the field. The morning light exposed details that had been hidden only an hour earlier. Burned track links, blackened engine grates, the torn hatch of the second Panther. Riflemen approached the wrecks cautiously, guided by officers who wanted confirmation of the kills and assurance that no hidden crewmen lay in wait with sidearms. The tanks, once engines of fear during nightly probes, now looked still and defeated. The infantry studied them with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Corporal Elias Vance remained near the hedgerow where he had executed his rope system. He knelt with a field notebook pressed against his thigh, documenting distances, timings, and approximate positions of each event. A few soldiers watched him write, trying to understand how someone could treat a battlefield like a drafting room. Vance ignored them and focused on the sequence. He sketched the Panther's approach vectors. He added the intervals between sound pulses. He marked firing angles with careful accuracy. Even after the successful ambush, he treated the event as data, not celebration. The platoon sergeant approached and crouched beside him. He scanned the notebook and let out a short breath. He told Vance that command wanted details as soon as possible. Higher units had heard about the twin ambush and sent runners to confirm the report. The sergeant added that officers from the battalion's anti-tank detachment were already asking questions. They wanted to know how a rope system could position crews with such precision in near darkness. Vance nodded and closed the notebook. He stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. The sergeant studied him for a moment before saying that most men relied on instinct. Vance relied on measurement. That difference had saved lives. Vance lowered his eyes and said he only applied what he knew. He had spent years laying out boundaries and pipeline routes across undeveloped land. Darkness never stopped the work. Lines had to be straight even in poor visibility. The sergeant shook his head softly and said the war had strange ways of turning civilian habits into battlefield tools. When battalion officers arrived, they approached Vance with a cautious seriousness. They asked how he developed the rope markers. They asked why he used glow tape, how he determined spacing, and what angles he calculated. Vance explained his process without embellishment. He spoke clearly, outlining each step in the method. He described the 3 rope types. He described the difference between marker strips and positional strips. The officers listened closely, recognizing that his explanation contained no guesswork. It was a system built from geometry, experience with terrain, and an understanding of tank behavior. One officer pointed out that glow tape might reveal positions if a flare burst overhead. Vance agreed and explained how he kept the strips facing downward, limiting visibility to within a foot. He recommended covering the strips with thin dust or grass if flares became a frequent German tactic. Another officer asked if the ropes could be deployed under fire. Vance responded that the system worked best when placed before a probe started. It required quiet, but once in place, soldiers only needed to follow the markers by touch. The officers exchanged glances. They recognized the value. They also recognized that the method needed documentation. They asked Vance to prepare a simple diagram that could be sent to adjacent companies. Vance nodded and pulled his notebook open again. In minutes he produced a diagram displaying rope lengths, marker spacing, and standard angles for flanking shots against Panthers and Panzer IVs. The officers took the sketch and moved briskly toward their headquarters tent. By mid-morning, word had spread across nearby units. Infantrymen from other platoons visited the hedgerow where the ambush occurred, examining the terrain to understand how such a precise strike had taken place in near darkness. Many asked Vance how he developed the idea. He answered each question with calm practicality. He never used dramatic explanations. He never described inspiration as intuition. He explained surveying patterns, slope measurement, and the logic of using tactile guides when visibility collapsed. Some soldiers nodded with comprehension. Others stared blankly, understanding only the outcome, not the method. The battlefield remained tense. German forces were expected to regroup after the failed probe. Officers instructed men to prepare for renewed pressure once smoke cleared from the wrecks. Allied units strengthened their positions with additional sandbags, deeper firing slits, and improvised obstacles placed between hedgerows. Despite the preparation, morale lifted noticeably. The destruction of 2 Panthers without casualties had delivered something rare in the Normandy campaign. Proof that German night tactics could be countered. Vance spent the quiet hours refining his ropes. He scraped excess dirt from the strips. He inspected knots. He tested tension. He replaced worn cloth segments with scraps taken from ration bags. His focus did not waver. For him, the ambush was only a first demonstration. The real value would come if the method survived scrutiny and replication. He wanted it reliable enough for any soldier to use, not just those comfortable with measurement. The platoon lieutenant arrived and asked Vance to walk him through the approach corridors again. Vance guided him across the ridgeline, pointing out how the soil compacted where previous tank movement had shaped subtle depressions. He explained how Panther crews used these contours because they offered predictable traction and minimized noise. The lieutenant, impressed by the clarity of the explanation, remarked that Vance saw lines where others saw disorder. Vance responded that land always contained lines. People simply failed to look for them. As they walked, distant artillery rumbled from deeper German positions. The sound carried across open fields, striking the hedges with short echoes. The lieutenant said the Germans would not abandon the airfield perimeter easily. They needed the ground for their defensive network. Vance agreed. He expected more probes. He expected heavier armor. He expected that the system he built would require adaptation. Later, as the sun reached its peak, a reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead, circling the area. It documented the Panther wrecks and sent confirmation to headquarters. The sight of the burned tanks boosted confidence among riflemen who had spent nights terrified by unseen treads. They gathered near Vance in small groups, discussing the method he created. Some wanted to help refine it. Others suggested adding colored cloth strips for different positions. Vance declined those ideas. Complexity created confusion. The system needed simplicity. By late afternoon, neighboring companies requested demonstrations. The battalion ordered Vance to prepare a short instructional walkthrough. He worked with the platoon sergeant to lay ropes in an unused hedgerow corridor. Soldiers gathered silently as he explained how to read the markers. He showed how firing angles emerged naturally from the rope layout. He guided 2 volunteers through the process, letting them follow the ropes to the firing position with their eyes closed. The volunteers reached the correct point each time. The demonstration ended with murmurs of approval. The system worked. Officers drafted a brief field bulletin recommending trial use across the line. They emphasized that the method required discipline and precise placement. Vance listened as they described his idea with growing authority. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and restraint. Recognition mattered less than survival. If this system kept men alive, then it served its purpose. That night, soldiers prepared their rifles with a steadier confidence. The ropes lay coiled and ready. The airfield perimeter waited. The 4th night after the ambush arrived with a weather shift that unsettled the entire sector. A dense maritime fog rolled inland from the channel, thickening as it drifted through the hedgerow maze. Visibility fell to less than 10 meters. The air felt wet and heavy. Moisture clung to uniforms and collected on helmet rims. Even experienced scouts struggled to orient themselves in the haze. German units had learned to exploit such conditions. Fog muted sound, reduced muzzle flash detection, and concealed armored silhouettes until they were almost on top of the line. Officers across the perimeter expected a renewed probe under cover of this natural camouflage. Corporal Elias Vance anticipated the same. He studied the fog with the same attention he once gave early morning inversions on construction sites. Moisture altered sound. Distances compressed. Tank rumbles sounded closer than they were. Echoes traveled in irregular patterns. These variables made rope guidance even more critical. His system did not rely on vision. It relied on touch and placement. Fog strengthened its value. He retrieved his coils and prepared new segments with slightly thicker cloth markers to ensure soldiers could feel them even through gloves slick with condensation. At 2,300 hours, Battalion Command ordered all units to stand by. Radio intercepts suggested that German armor near the Carpiquet perimeter had repositioned. The familiar low thrumming of Panther engines began shortly afterward. This time the sound came from 2 directions instead of 1. The enemy intended to test multiple corridors simultaneously. Vance and the platoon sergeant exchanged a look. They had prepared 2 rope lanes but not 3. The fog made guessing the main assault lane almost impossible. Vance knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. He listened again. One sound carried a slightly sharper metallic rattle. That indicated a panther using a corridor with more stones under its tracks. He knew which corridor contained that feature. He pointed left and said that would be the primary approach. The sergeant trusted him enough not to argue. Vance began placing the ropes swiftly. He crouched low, moved silently, and dropped each line into the exact intervals marked earlier that afternoon. He double-checked alignment by touch. He pressed glow tape strips deeper into the damp soil to dull their faint reflection even further. Despite the fog, the placement remained accurate. The Panzerschreck team followed behind him, watching his hand motions. The lead German tank advanced with surprising speed for a probe. Fog emboldened the crew. They pushed deeper into the corridor than usual, creating sharp mechanical clanks as they drove across uneven ground. Infantry along the line gripped their weapons but held fire according to command discipline. Vance listened. He counted the time between gear shifts. The tank was closing rapidly. He signaled the Panzerschreck crew to kneel. They followed the rope markers by touch, finding their way to the firing angle in seconds. The loader steadied himself. The gunner prepared the tube. The fog swallowed most sound. The Panther emerged as a faint shadow. Its presence felt more than seen. Vance placed a hand against the hedge, feeling the vibration through the wood. He whispered for the team to wait. Firing too early risked a glancing shot. They needed the tank's flank to expose for a full second. The moment arrived when the Panther adjusted its heading to avoid a ditch depression. That tiny shift expanded the angle by just enough. The gunner fired. The backblast glowed briefly against the fog and vanished. The rocket struck the Panther's flank with a muffled explosion. The wet air dampened the crack but not the impact. Sparks cascaded under the vehicle. Flames poured from the rear compartment. The tank halted abruptly. German crewmen inside scrambled in disoriented panic. Riflemen waited for orders. Officers told them to hold positions. The fog made crossfire risky. The second Panther reacted with the same caution observed days earlier. It stopped behind the burning wreck, trying to assess the threat. The commander likely assumed a mine or concealed gun pit, not an infantry-fired weapon. Panzerschreck's signatures were difficult to see in fog. The German commander ordered a pivot maneuver, intending to face the threat head-on. Vance watched the turret's silhouette turn through the haze. He recognized the pivot trajectory. The tank would expose its side again, but only briefly. He signaled the crew to relocate. They moved along the rope's secondary path. Their hands slid across damp markers. They passed one strip, then two, then stopped at the triple strip. They knelt. The gunner reloaded. Fog collected on the launcher tube. The loader wiped the rear end with a quick motion to prevent misfire. They aligned without seeing anything beyond a shadow. The second rocket fired. It hit lower than intended but still penetrated the weakened plate. The tank shuddered and almost toppled into the ditch. Flames erupted across its engine deck. German voices shouted inside. The hatch opened. Two crewmen climbed out, stumbling across the ditch. Riflemen waited until they reached open ground, then seized them without resistance. The fog made the aftermath strange and muted. Flames burned quietly. Smoke drifted upward in thin columns. Visibility remained minimal. Officers ordered all units to tighten security. They feared additional tanks might follow. None did. The Germans had lost 2 more Panthers within minutes. Their probing doctrine had met a counter they could not anticipate. After the engagement, battalion commanders summoned Vance to a command tent. They wanted a detailed explanation of how he identified the primary corridor despite the fog. Vance described soil characteristics, vibration patterns, and the metallic resonance produced by track links hitting irregular stones. The officers listened intently. They realized that his experience exceeded standard infantry training. They asked if he had formal engineering education. Vance shook his head. He explained that surveying taught him to read land, not textbooks. Command decided to document his method formally. They assigned a clerk to record his explanations. They ordered diagrams, step-by-step instructions, and recommended materials. They wanted a full field manual draft that could be distributed to other regiments operating in bocage terrain. Vance requested time to refine his system before finalizing the document. The officers agreed. They understood that improvisation required iteration. Back at the platoon position, soldiers treated Vance differently. They asked for guidance on reading slopes. They asked how to determine silent movement corridors. They asked how to identify angles in darkness. Vance responded to each question patiently. His tone never shifted to authority. He viewed the method as shared knowledge, not personal accomplishment. Even the sergeant, once doubtful, now asked him to inspect new defensive positions. Vance walked the line with him, pointing out flaws in angles, recommending small improvements, and adjusting the placement of rifle pits. His analysis changed how the entire platoon understood terrain. They began to see their environment as a series of measurable elements instead of a shapeless battlefield. German forces attempted no further probes that night. Fog held until dawn. When sunlight returned, it revealed another pair of destroyed Panthers. Infantry gathered around them again, reaffirming the effectiveness of the rope system. Officers reported the results to division headquarters. They emphasized that the method allowed precise anti-tank engagements in near-zero visibility. Vance remained focused on improvement. Success mattered, but durability mattered more. He spent hours adjusting rope thickness, marker spacing, and deployment speed. He created variations for different tank models. He prepared contingency plans for nights with flares or artillery illumination. His method evolved into a comprehensive system rather than a single trick. Soldiers across multiple companies began calling it the Vance line, though he disliked the name. The next stage would test whether the system could be replicated widely. Division headquarters reviewed the reports from Carpiquet and reacted with an urgency rarely applied to small unit innovations. Night probes by German armor had disrupted multiple sectors across Normandy. Commanders needed solutions that did not depend on large-caliber guns or clear weather. The chalk line rope method, now renamed in official memos as directional tactile guidance, offered exactly that. Division ordered 3 companies to implement trial use within 48 hours. They assigned liaison officers to learn the system directly from Corporal Elias Vance. Vance demonstrated the ropes again, this time under structured observation. Officers recorded each step. They noted the silent deployment, the spacing logic, and the angles produced by simple physical placement. They tested the method with volunteers who had no surveying background. Each volunteer navigated the ropes with consistent accuracy. Confidence grew. An instruction sheet was drafted by afternoon. A field bulletin followed. By evening, ropes were being constructed in supply tents using spare cord, ration cloth, and strips of glow tape pulled from aircraft panel kits. Despite the rapid spread, Vance maintained strict emphasis on discipline. He warned that poor placement could misalign firing angles and create fatal exposure. He insisted that soldiers understand the terrain before deploying ropes. Officers respected his caution. They recognized that his method was not magic. It was precision applied in darkness, a fragile advantage if misused. Crews adapted quickly. Within days, multiple platoons reported improved confidence during nocturnal engagements. The Germans noticed the difference. Their Panther probes grew shorter, more hesitant. Crews fired illumination rounds at random intervals, attempting to reveal hidden ambush sites. The flares lit the hedgerows in pale arcs, but the ropes remained invisible, pressed into soil and concealed by moisture. German reports later recovered from abandoned command posts described Allied infantry as unusually coordinated at night. They suspected new equipment. They never imagined that rope, tape, and a land surveyor's mind produced the shift. As the Carpiquet perimeter finally widened under sustained Allied pressure, Vance continued refining his system. He developed shorter rope sets for rapid ambush teams. He taught squads how to measure angles by counting steps at fixed intervals. He created reference patterns that allowed quick deployment even under fire. His platoon relied on him not just as a technician but as a stabilizing presence. His precision calmed them. His process gave them control in an environment defined by uncertainty. After the campaign, higher command submitted recommendations for commendation. Vance received a citation for battlefield innovation that improved anti-tank effectiveness during the Normandy operations. The recognition was modest. His method never became widely famous. It appeared only in a few after-action reports and a single manual appendix that saw limited distribution before the end of the war. Larger battles overshadowed smaller innovations. Strategic victories consumed historical attention. Vance returned to civilian life with no expectation of broader acknowledgement. He went back to land surveying. He walked fields again, measuring slopes, marking boundaries, and drawing lines across quiet terrain. Colleagues saw nothing unusual in his work. They never knew that the same precision once guided soldiers toward perfect firing angles in darkness thick with fear. He never described those nights unless asked directly. When asked, he spoke with calm simplicity, saying that land always revealed its lines if someone cared enough to look. His contribution faded from public memory, but the soldiers who survived because of his ropes remembered. They remembered how a simple system restored their confidence against armored shadows. They remembered how precision defeated panic. They remembered how one man's quiet skill changed the balance in a narrow strip of Normandy hedgerow where two panthers burned, and fear lifted for the first time in days.